During this series, we've seen a lot about the history in the Bible. But how important is it, how necessary is it to know a bit about the history of the Bible?
Yeah, the question that we have to face is that when we open a Bible today, even one that's 200 or 300 years old, but more likely one that's just been printed a few years ago, we are heirs to a very long tradition where people have been studying and reading and retranslating and reinterpreting the Bible in different circumstances. Some people worry about that as though that actually falsifies it. It means that we're at the end of a long and rather difficult chain and so on. But actually, I think it reflects something of what the Bible actually is. That the New Testament is the book which says this is where that great story that we now call the Old Testament came to its climax, in other words, in Jesus, and that Jesus generated a whole new world going out into the rest of creation. And that's why from the beginning, the early Christians were translators. They put the Bible, they wrote it in Greek, not in Aramaic or Hebrew, and the Bible has been translated into language after language. Because the Bible is not the sort of book that you can look at for a few minutes, get the right answers, put those answers in your pocket and think, there it is, we don't need to think anymore. The Bible challenges each generation to think afresh, to think differently. And that's bound to be the case because the Bible is the book that fuels and funds the mission of the church in different situations. So when we read the Bible today, it's really important to know about the people who've read it before us and the tradition of interpretation. These are our brothers and sisters from previous generations, and we're all part of the same family, and we need to be reflective as we read the Bible today about the other people who've read it before us and the ideas that they've had, not so that we can just say, well, they got it right, so we don't need to think, but that they will stimulate us to do for our generation what they did for theirs.
I'm here in the Pontifical Biblical Institute in the heart of Rome, one of the most beautiful and lavish libraries in Rome. What I want to talk about for a few moments is the text of the New Testament. Was it reliably transmitted over the centuries? Well, we can say a few things about that. First of all, we have to say that there are thousands of manuscripts. And in these manuscripts, there are also thousands of variations. But usually the variations are just changes in wording or spelling, usually minor stuff like that. Other times we do have a few problems where a cheeky scribe has done something a bit peculiar. Or to give another example, in the Olivet Discourse, there's that section where Jesus says about the day or the hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven or the Son. And some scribe says, hang on, if Jesus is God, how could he not know? So they admitted that part about the Son not knowing the day or the hour. And there are a few problems as well, like the doxology of Romans. And we've got some good attestation for it. We know that doxology should be in Romans, but it's in a variety of places in Romans in our manuscripts. But for the most part, the manuscripts show a great degree of stability and sameness. And they're available not just in Greek and Latin. We have them in various versions. We have them in Armenian, we have them in Syriac, we have them in Arabic. And we can compare all these manuscripts over the centuries in all the different languages. And the actual science of this has become fairly well developed. Because some of our manuscripts go all the way back to the 2nd century. Like one of my favorites, P52, it's got a small portion of the Gospel of John, and that's datable somewhere between 125 to about the end of the 2nd century. And we've got these wonderful codices from the 4th century, like Codex Vaticanus and my favorite, Codex Sinaiticus, that was discovered in the 1860s. And we can go through them and we can see how the New Testament has been translated over the ages. And what we find is that there is what we could call a macro level stability. There is a genuine continuity and stability over the ages, but there are a large number of micro level variations with differences in wording and spelling and maybe the odd phrase or the odd verse put in a different place here and there. For the most part, though, we can be quite confident that the Bible we have and the Bible we read from is the best approximation we can make of the original autographs.
Sitting here in a library surrounded by books from the 17th and 18th century, it might be easy to imagine that books had always looked more or less like this. But as we know, if we'd been in a library in Rome 2,000 years ago, you wouldn't have seen books, you'd have seen scrolls, and they'd have been in little cubbyholes or pigeonholes. And that's how the great poets and historians of the first century would have been published. But by the time we get quite early on into the Christian movement, we find the early Christians using not scrolls, but early books called codexes or codices. After all, in the beginning, the scrolls that they will have used for the very early manuscripts of the New Testament are vulnerable. We know from looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls that often the beginning and end of a scroll, the bits that attach to the rods at either end, are the bits that can get damaged. And it's possible that some of the early Christian manuscripts suffered that way. But the early Christians seem to have wanted to do one thing in particular, and that was to be able to have all four Gospels quite literally bound up together. You couldn't get them all on a scroll, you could get them into a codex. And by the end of the 2nd century, we have Irenaeus, one of the great teachers of the church in that period, arguing that it was God's plan that there should be 4 Gospels. Irenaeus was aware of other traditions and other sayings and other things that were being collected. But for him, living and writing at a time of intense persecution, Irenaeus knew that these 4 books were the ones which made it clear that following Jesus may mean carrying your cross, may mean giving up your life. Some of the other traditions which are around at the time were about developing your own private spirituality. But these 4 books are about the kingdom of God coming on earth as in heaven, and they were therefore essential as part of the early Christian kit.
How do we get from these ancient manuscripts like Codex Vaticanus or Codex Sinaiticus to our modern Bibles? Well, in the early church, they tended to use, for the most part, the Greek New Testament, the New Testament in Greek. In fact, their Old Testament was largely in Greek too. But for the Western church, they obviously began to put the Bible from Greek into Latin, since it was in the Latin-speaking West. And there was a plethora of Latin translations and texts and editions that were coming out. You know, every man and his dog was making his own Latin translation of the Bible, and some of them were better than others. So one of the leading scholars of the day, a chap called Jerome, in the 5th century, was charged with creating an official and authorized translation of the Bible into Latin for the Catholic Church. And he did that. He did it very well, and that became known as the Vulgate. And that was basically the Bible for the Western Church for the next 1,000 or so years. Much later, in the early 16th century, there is a burgeoning interest in the Greek text of the New Testament. And one particular guy by the name of Erasmus, he's commissioned to put together a Greek text of the New Testament to be printed and published. And he does this, and it becomes very, very popular. And in fact, a lot of the continental reformers would use the Greek text put together by Erasmus. However, Erasmus's text was based on some rather late and poor quality Byzantine manuscripts. And so he kept finding more manuscripts and using them. And his actual text went through about 5 editions. It was Erasmus's text that became known as the Textus Receptus, the received text, and this was used as the basis for the translation of the King James Bible. However, over the next few centuries, more Greek manuscripts were discovered. Famously, Tischendorf went to the Sinai and he discovered Codex Sinaiticus, and this was a great discovery. We had a whole new codex, a near complete New Testament that could be used for the study of the Greek text of the Bible. And then in the late 19th century, you get some chaps like Westcott and Hort, and they begin relying not so much on Erasmus's Textus Receptus, but they take a more eclectic approach. They look at all the manuscripts they have available, and then they decide which readings are the best, which are the more accurate, which are the ones most likely to reflect the original text. And they produce a text that differs a bit from the Textus Receptus, and thus the English translations based on it also begin to differ a little bit then from the King James Bible. And it's the text created by Westcott and Hort and then developed by the United Bible Societies in numerous editions that becomes the basis for most English translations of the New Testament. And that, in a nutshell, is how we got our English Bible today.
Before I had any thoughts of becoming a Bible translator myself, one of my great heroes when I was still quite young was William Tyndale, perhaps the father of the English Bible. Okay, there were other people who had translated the Bible or bits of it into English before, notably Wycliffe, but it was Tyndale at the start of the 16th century who made this his life's ambition and work. Tyndale, like many other people in England in the first 2 decades of the 16th century, was fed up with the way in which the church that he knew, the church that he saw, seemed to be careless about getting the Bible into the hearts and minds of ordinary people. The Bible was something which was read in Latin. The ordinary people didn't understand Latin. And so many of the clergy would just say, we will tell you what it means. And Tyndale, like many others, like More and Erasmus before him, could see that this just wasn't good enough. Something had to be done to get the Bible out of this sacred preserve where so much of it was hushed up and where you only learnt the bits which would keep you safe and sound and not doing or thinking anything subversive. But Tyndale, dangerously, had studied Martin Luther and some of the other early German reformers. And so in the 1520s, Tyndale was working on two things: to translate some of Luther's treatises and to write some of his own, to explain to people what a more vibrant personal Christianity might look like rather than the official religion that they'd known, but then particularly to translate the Bible into English, and not just into a sonorous, somnolent sort of English, but into a lively, bouncy, in-your-face sort of English, so that when we compare Tyndale with the King James Version of nearly 100 years later, even though there's a fair proportion of King James which is straight out of Tyndale, again and again it has become more courtly, more royal, whereas Tyndale is all about the language of the ordinary people, the language you'd hear in the shops and on the street. At one point he says that he wants a ploughboy to be able to be reciting this and singing the Psalms as he's going about his work, rather than simply having academics in dusty studies and libraries doing it. Tyndale found that this is a very dangerous thing to do. Most people today, when they study and translate the Bible, do so quite safely in libraries in Western academies, although there are people translating and commenting on the Bible in areas of the world where still today that is a very dangerous thing to do. You could lose your life, you could get banished. And Tyndale found that he had to leave England and go to the continent, where he could be in hiding and get on with his work, shipping back to England portions of the Bible to be published and disseminated among the little Protestant groups that were developing in the 1520s and the early 1530s. Now, at one point, Thomas Cromwell, made famous in the Wolf Hall book and movie, was eager to bring Tyndale back to England so that he could be part of a sort of moderate reformation that he had in mind. Tyndale wasn't having that. It was to be a thorough biblical reformation or nothing at all. And in the end, he paid for that dream with his life when he was killed, burnt at the stake in 1535. But within a short time, Bibles in English were placed by royal command in every parish in the land. Tyndale had got his dream, even though he'd had to die for it. And one of the great things that's happened in our own day is the way in which different Christian denominations, who at that time might have been hostile to the Bible being translated out of Latin into other languages, are now saying we need to have the Bible accessible to ordinary people in their own language, so that anyone, man, woman, or child, who wants to study it and read it for themselves can do so. That was Tyndale's dream. It's been my dream all my life, and it's wonderful to see it going ahead in today's and tomorrow's world. In the ancient world, without the benefit of modern printing and computers and so on, books were published by teams of scribes who copied them out word by word. Now, if you've ever copied out anything, from a poem to a page of history, from a shopping list to a chapter from a textbook, you'll have noticed how easy it is for mistakes to creep in. The eye jumps to and fro. We often leap from a word at one point in a sentence to the same word occurring a bit later in the sentence, and we miss out the bit in the middle. Or perhaps we go back from the end of one line to the start of the same line by mistake, and so copy a bit of it out twice, and so on. Sometimes, if we're copying out a poem and we know a similar poem already, we may instinctively adjust the one we're copying so that it's more like the one we already know. Sometimes we may be startled by what the writer says or the way they say it. We may think, surely he didn't really mean that, and we may try to smooth things out a bit. Now, All of these things and many other similar problems were bound to creep in as the early Christians copied and recopied the New Testament. We have hundreds of manuscripts of the New Testament, either as a whole or more often in parts. And actually, there are far more early manuscripts of the New Testament than of any other books from the ancient world. Not the works of Julius Caesar, not Plato, not Homer or Virgil. Some of the greatest classical texts exist today only in one or two medieval copies, and then, of course, the modern editions. But for the New Testament, there is so much early evidence it hurts. And it's no surprise that in many of those manuscripts, there are slight or even larger variations. It's inevitable. Now, these variations have been studied intensively in the last 200 years as more and more manuscripts have come to light. A whole careful science has been built up, which we call textual criticism. This scientific analysis of variations in the manuscripts is designed to get us back as close as we can, line after line, book after book, to what the original authors wrote. And the good news is that the evidence for the New Testament as a whole is massively strong. We can be quite sure that, despite plenty of small-scale variations here and there, we are reading substantially what the writers intended us to read. They were telling the story of how God became king, and that comes through loud and clear, no matter how many little turns and twists and footnotes there may be. But it's always worth checking things out in any given passage, in a good modern edition of the Greek, just as in the Hebrew of the Old Testament, or indeed then in some of the English translations, which tell you where there are variations here and there. And even when we are looking at something that a later scribe has added or omitted by accident, what we're seeing there is important as well. It's a little slice of early church history as a faithful and perhaps exhausted worker doing his laborious best to get the message through so the next generation too can be drawn into worship and energized into mission. As such a person is doing their best and just makes little mistakes. That too is part of our history. After all, we are doing our best and we make quite a few mistakes as well.